The truth is, most people misunderstand this. The vast majority of humanity walks through the world believing that language is simply a sterile tool for exchanging mundane facts. A benign vehicle for transferring data from one isolated mind to another. They assume that when they speak or write, the recipient processes the information logically, weighing the merits of the argument with cold, calculating reason, untouched by invisible forces. This is a devastating, fundamental illusion. Language, in its purest, most weaponized form, is not a conveyor belt of static facts, it is a mechanism of profound psychological manipulation. It is the invisible architecture of human belief, the subtle sculptor of deepest desire, and the silent, ruthless assassin of critical thought. To truly understand the devastating power of the written word, one must journey into the abyss of absolute desperation, into the archetypal life of a man who possessed nothing but the ragged clothes on his back and a mind fractured by the brutal, unforgiving reality of the streets. Imagine a solitary figure, stripped of dignity and starved of sustenance, wandering the merciless concrete landscape of a modern metropolis. This man was entirely invisible to the passing, hurried masses. His voice, when he dared to raise it from the gutter to beg for a sliver of salvation, was instantly drowned out by the roar of the city and the crushing apathy of the human heart. He was a ghost trapped in the realm of the living, a victim of a society that only recognizes value when it is forcefully, unavoidably presented. It was within this dark crucible of profound suffering that a revolutionary awakening occurred. The man realized that his physical starvation was merely a surface symptom of a much deeper, more insidious affliction. He suffered from a complete and total lack of influence. His inability to compel another human being to pause, to listen, and to act was the true source of his destitution. He understood, with a terrifying, crystal clarity, that survival in this modern jungle did not depend on physical strength or moral virtue, but entirely on the ability to capture, control, and direct the attention of others. Driven by a primal, biological instinct to survive, the destitute man sought refuge in the quiet, dusty sanctuaries of massive public libraries. He did not seek literature for fleeting entertainment, he sought the ancient, hidden blueprints of human psychology. He systematically devoured the forgotten texts of early mail-order advertisers, the pioneer copywriters who understood exactly how to extract wealth from distant strangers using nothing but black ink on a white page. He studied the rhythmic cadences of historical preachers who could whip a docile congregation into a frenzied state of religious ecstasy. The calculated declarations of wartime politicians who could command the absolute loyalty of millions. And the hypnotic, mesmerizing prose of masterful novelists who could trap a reader within a fabricated reality for hours on end. As he absorbed these forbidden, powerful texts, a terrifying and magnificent realization began to take shape within his mind. The human brain, he discovered, is not an impenetrable, logical fortress of rational thought, it is a highly vulnerable, deeply flawed biological machine, wired with ancient evolutionary triggers that can be activated by specific, deliberate sequences of words. He learned that every human being walks through life in a perpetual state of waking trance, completely absorbed by their own internal monologues, their paralyzing anxieties, their unspoken fears, and their desperate, unfulfilled desires. The average person is entirely deaf to the noise of the outside world, heavily barricaded behind a thick wall of apathy. To penetrate this cognitive fortress, to forcefully break the trance of everyday existence, one cannot simply knock politely on the door with logical arguments and bulleted facts. One must detonate an emotional explosive directly at the gates of their perception. This was the genesis of what would eventually be known as the dark art of hypnotic writing. It is the calculated practice of forcing a reader into a completely new, engineered trance. A fabricated state of hyper-focused attention where the outside world dissolves. The passage of time distorts, and the only reality that exists is the narrative unfolding on the page before them. The man understood that true, undeniable hypnosis does not require a swinging pocket watch or a swinging pendulum in a darkened room. It requires a psychological hook so devastatingly sharp and perfectly angled that the reader simply cannot look away, even if their rational mind screams at them to do so. He began to obsessively experiment with the anatomy of the sentence, dissecting the structural integrity of words to discover which specific combinations induced boredom and which combinations triggered involuntary physiological responses in the human nervous system. He realized that passive, academic, and bureaucratic language was the absolute enemy of influence. It was the language of sleep, the lullaby of the ignored. To awaken the reader, he had to deploy words that dripped with intense sensory detail, words that tasted of bitter, lingering regret or smelled of sudden, intoxicating wealth. He learned to weaponize verbs, transforming them from static descriptors into kinetic, driving forces that dragged the reader's imagination violently forward through the text. He understood that adjectives, when used sparingly and with surgical, ruthless precision, could paint terrifyingly vivid pictures in the private theater of the reader's mind. The writing process became an act of psychological alchemy, transmuting the base metal of common vocabulary into the pure, blinding gold of unyielding persuasion. The fundamental lesson extracted from this arduous journey into the mechanics of the human psyche is that all human behavior, without exception, is driven by an insatiable, underlying biological hunger. It is never truly about the product, the service, or the philosophical idea being presented. It is always, fundamentally, about the reader's desperate need to fill a gaping void within themselves. The amateur writer makes the fatal, predictable mistake of focusing entirely on the features of their offering, droning on endlessly about specifications, historical facts, and cold logic, entirely blind to the reality that the reader's subconscious is screaming a single, relentless question: what is in this for me? The master of hypnotic writing, however, bypasses the logical mind entirely and strikes directly at the bleeding heart of this ancient, selfish question. They understand that to capture a reader's soul, they must first identify the reader's most profound pain or their most deeply guarded secret fantasy. The narrative must become a flawless mirror in which the reader sees their own agonizing struggles and their own glorious potential salvation perfectly reflected back at them. When a person reads a piece of text that perfectly articulates the silent terrors they have never dared to voice aloud, an immediate, unbreakable, and profound bond of trust is formed. The critical faculty, the logical, doubting gatekeeper of the conscious mind, completely collapses under the weight of feeling understood. The reader subconsciously assumes that anyone who can so accurately and beautifully describe their pain must undoubtedly possess the absolute cure. This is the precise moment the waking trance takes absolute hold. The peripheral vision naturally narrows, the breathing synchronizes with the rhythm of the constructed sentences, and the reader willingly, eagerly surrenders their intellectual autonomy to the unseen author. The archetypal protagonist, now armed with this terrifying new psychological knowledge, began to craft his own messages to hurl into the void of the world. He no longer wrote to simply inform, he wrote to dominate and to conquer. He understood that the brutal battle for the reader's mind is won or lost in the very first fraction of a second. In the sudden, violent psychological impact of the headline. The headline, he realized, is not a polite summary of the text to follow, it is a calculated ambush. It is a psychological trap designed to instantly arrest the reader's momentum and force them, against their will, to pay the heavy toll of their undivided attention. He spent agonizing days and sleepless nights over a single string of words, constantly testing different emotional triggers, the paralyzing grip of fear, the insatiable pull of greed, the agonizing itch of curiosity, the burning heat of lust, and the blinding red of anger. He discovered that a headline promising a massive, effortless, life-altering benefit, while simultaneously whispering of a hidden, forbidden secret, was an irresistible, intoxicating combination. It created an agonizing psychological itch within the brain that could only be scratched by immediately reading the very next sentence. And that next sentence had only one singular, obsessive purpose: to force the reader to read the sentence directly after that. He constructed his paragraphs like a slippery, frictionless slide, a rapid descent into the depths of his persuasive argument, where the reader was constantly propelled downward by a relentless, overwhelming current of rising tension and unfulfilled, tantalizing promises. He mastered the dark art of the open loop, the technique of introducing a captivating mystery or a shocking revelation, only to abruptly suspend the narrative thread and promise the definitive answer at a much later point. This created an intolerable state of cognitive dissonance, a burning, almost physical need for psychological closure that physically bound the reader's eyes to the page. They were no longer reading by conscious choice, they were reading by absolute biological compulsion. As the once destitute man deployed these invisible, psychological weapons into the real world, his reality began to warp and restructure itself with a terrifying, breathtaking speed. The invisible, forgotten ghost of the city streets suddenly became a massive gravitational center of wealth, power, and overwhelming influence. The letters and articles he wrote, heavily infused with the dark, calculated magic of hypnotic syntax, acted as silent, tireless, invisible armies, marching undetected into the minds of thousands of strangers and systematically extracting their compliance, their unwavering trust, and their financial resources. He watched, fascinated and perhaps slightly appalled by the ease of it all, as rational individuals willingly handed over their fortunes in exchange for the carefully constructed promises woven into his rhythmic prose. He had discovered the ultimate cheat code to human existence. The profound realization that reality itself is completely malleable and submissive to those who know exactly how to manipulate the linguistic symbols that define it. The world is not fundamentally made of atoms and molecules, it is made of stories, narratives, and beliefs. And the person who controls the narrative controls the entire world. The power of hypnotic writing is the power of a minor godhood manifested on paper. The intoxicating ability to create entire universes within the strict confines of a margin. To summon raw, visceral emotions out of the thin ether. And to direct the course of human action without ever lifting a physical finger or raising a voice. Yet, this godlike power is not without its heavy, crushing, and deeply isolating psychological toll. To constantly view humanity not as a collection of beautiful, complex souls, but merely as a predictable series of biological buttons waiting to be pressed, requires a profound and terrifying emotional detachment. The master persuader must simultaneously possess the deepest, most agonizing empathy to truly understand the secret pain of the reader, and the coldest, most ruthless calculation to systematically exploit that exact pain for a specific, desired outcome. It is a perilous tightrope walk over an endless abyss of sociopathy. A dangerous, intoxicating dance between profound human connection and absolute, uncompromising manipulation. The lessons learned in these early, desperate days formed the unbreakable, bedrock foundation of a completely new science of communication. It became terrifyingly clear that the human brain operates on a series of deeply ingrained, evolutionary heuristics, cognitive shortcuts designed to save mental energy in what was once a highly dangerous, primitive world. When the modern brain encounters a stimulus that perfectly matches a specific, ancient pattern, a sudden threat to survival, the promise of a massive, unearned reward, or an unsolvable mystery, it completely bypasses conscious deliberation and instantly triggers an automatic, instinctual, and highly predictable response. Hypnotic writing is nothing more than the deliberate, systematic, and ruthless engineering of these exact psychological patterns. It is the silent insertion of a cognitive Trojan horse into the mental fortress of the audience. The master writer meticulously cloaks their ultimate, self-serving intention in the comforting, familiar language of the reader's own deepest desires, slipping past the heavily armed guards of doubt entirely undetected. They use embedded commands, hiding powerful psychological directives within the complex structure of a seemingly innocent, meandering sentence, completely bypassing the conscious, analytical mind and planting a vibrant seed of action directly into the fertile soil of the subconscious. They utilize the overwhelming power of repetition, not the clumsy, obvious, and irritating repetition of a cheap television commercial, but the subtle, rhythmic, almost musical echoing of a core emotional theme, slowly wearing down the reader's natural resistance like persistent water carving a canyon through solid, unyielding stone. They master the intricate dance of pacing and leading, first reflecting the reader's current, agonizing reality with absolute, undeniable, and shocking accuracy, and then slowly, imperceptibly, shifting the narrative trajectory to lead the trusting reader directly toward the writer's desired conclusion. The reader firmly believes they are walking this path of their own free, unburdened will, completely and utterly unaware that every single step was meticulously paved, measured, and dictated by the unseen architect of the text. The invisible architect of the text did not rest upon his initial triumphs. He recognized that the initial psychological breach, the violent capture of attention through a sensational headline, was merely the first skirmish in a much longer, infinitely more grueling war for the reader's soul, to hold a mind captive, to prevent the waking trance from shattering under the intrusive demands of the real world. Required a narrative architecture of astonishing resilience and deeply calculated emotional manipulation. He turned his obsessive scrutiny away from the fiery preachers and the aggressive merchants, directing it instead toward the quiet, unassuming masters of popular fiction, the architects of the classic murder mystery. He dissected their novels not for literary merit, but for the raw, underlying mechanics of sustained psychological tension. He discovered that these authors were, in essence, grand manipulators of the human dopamine system. They understood that the brain is hardwired to seek closure, to abhor a vacuum of information. By introducing a bloody corpse in the very first chapter and deliberately withholding the identity of the killer, they created a massive, agonizing open loop in the reader's mind. The reader was no longer turning pages for pleasure, they were turning pages out of a desperate, biological necessity to resolve the cognitive dissonance created by the unsolved puzzle. The master persuader realized that this exact mechanism could be perfectly transplanted into the realm of persuasive writing. He began to weave deeply compelling, seemingly unrelated narratives into his sales letters, introducing a fascinating protagonist facing an insurmountable, agonizing problem, a problem that perfectly mirrored the secret, unvoiced desperation of his target audience. He would build the tension to an unbearable crescendo, bringing the protagonist to the absolute brink of total ruin. And then, at the very climax of the story, he would abruptly halt the narrative. He would pivot seamlessly into a discussion of his product or philosophical concept, leaving the story unresolved. The reader, physically unable to abandon the agonizing tension of the unfinished tale, was violently dragged through the dense, persuasive arguments, their eyes devouring the logical justifications in a desperate sprint to reach the narrative resolution waiting at the end of the text. It was a flawless psychological trap, a labyrinth of words where the only exit was total compliance. This mastery of the open loop revealed a profound, unsettling truth about the dual nature of human cognition. The master writer observed the masses making catastrophic financial decisions, remaining in toxic relationships, and self-sabotaging their own success, all while fiercely defending their choices with flawless, impenetrable walls of logic. He realized that the human animal is not a rational creature that occasionally feels emotions. It is a profoundly emotional creature that uses a thin veneer of rationality to justify its primal urges. When a person decides to purchase a luxury automobile they cannot afford, they do not make the decision based on the engineering specifications of the engine or the aerodynamic efficiency of the chassis. They make the decision in a blinding flash of emotional desire, driven by a desperate, agonizing need for social status, a terrifying fear of inadequacy, or a hollow yearning for the fleeting illusion of power. It is only after the emotional decision has been completely solidified in the subconscious that the conscious mind scrambles to construct a logical defense, eagerly grasping at fuel efficiency ratings and safety features to justify the massive, irrational expenditure. The master of hypnotic writing understood that arguing with the logical, conscious mind was a fool's errand, a frontal assault on a heavily fortified bunker. Instead, he deployed his words like a stealth bomber, flying high above the radar of critical thought to drop payloads of pure, unadulterated emotion directly into the vulnerable, unprotected heart of the reader's subconscious. He painted vivid, intoxicating pictures of the reader's ultimate fantasy realized, using language so incredibly dense with sensory detail that the reader could physically feel the warmth of the sun on their skin, taste the sweet, metallic tang of absolute victory, and hear the intoxicating applause of their peers. He bypassed the intellect entirely, forging a direct, intravenous connection to the reader's deepest, most primitive desires. Once the emotional fire was violently ignited, the battle was completely won. The reader's own mind would eagerly supply the necessary logic to justify the predetermined emotional surrender. To achieve this level of visceral, sensory overload, the master writer had to become a ruthless, uncompromising tyrant over his own vocabulary. He realized that the vast majority of human communication is heavily polluted with dead, lifeless words, bureaucratic jargon, academic abstractions, and the cowardly, suffocating weight of the passive voice. When a writer says that a decision was made to implement the strategy, the sentence is a bloodless corpse, utterly devoid of human agency, kinetic energy, or emotional impact. It is the language of evasion, the dialect of the invisible bureaucrat desperate to avoid accountability. The hypnotic writer understood that to induce a waking trance, the language must be fiercely active, bursting with aggressive, forward momentum. He stripped his sentences of every unnecessary adjective and every cowardly, modifying adverb. He replaced weak, meandering verbs with violent, explosive actions. Instead of writing that a man moved quickly across the room, he wrote that the man slashed through the dense, suffocating silence of the parlor. He understood that every single syllable was a vital, finite resource, and any word that did not actively propel the reader deeper into the psychological abyss of the text was an enemy that had to be mercilessly eradicated. This brutal, agonizing process of editing was not merely about grammatical correctness, it was a process of intense psychological distillation. He boiled his prose down until nothing remained but the raw, pulsating nerve of persuasion. He studied the rhythmic cadences of spoken poetry, recognizing that the human brain is highly susceptible to the hypnotic, repetitive beat of a perfectly structured sentence. He varied the length of his paragraphs with the calculated precision of a musical composer, using short, staccato sentences to violently accelerate the reader's heart rate, and long, flowing, hypnotic passages to lull the critical mind into a deep, unsuspecting slumber. The writing ceased to be a mere arrangement of symbols on a page, it became a living, breathing entity, a psychological predator perfectly evolved to hunt and capture the wandering attention of the modern human mind. The application of these dark, powerful principles extended far beyond the realm of mere commercial persuasion. The master writer recognized that the very fabric of human society is held together by invisible threads of hypnotic language. The politician rallying a terrified nation to war does not use bullet points and logical deductions, they use soaring, emotionally devastating rhetoric, painting terrifying portraits of the enemy and glorious, golden visions of ultimate victory. The religious leader commanding the absolute devotion of their flock relies on the ancient, rhythmic repetition of sacred texts, utilizing profound metaphors and emotionally charged parables to bypass the rational mind and speak directly to the soul's desperate yearning for eternal salvation. Even in the deeply intimate theater of romantic love, the silent, unspoken language of attraction is heavily augmented by the hypnotic power of whispered promises, shared secrets, and the intoxicating, rhythmic cadence of a lover's voice. The individual who masters the art of hypnotic writing suddenly finds themselves wielding the very same weapons utilized by the greatest leaders, tyrants, and saviors in human history. They possess the terrifying ability to implant thoughts directly into the minds of strangers, to alter the fundamental trajectory of a person's life with a single, perfectly crafted paragraph. It is a power that demands an almost superhuman level of psychological resilience and ethical clarity. For the line between liberating a mind and completely enslaving it is perilously, microscopically thin. The master writer, looking out over the sprawling, chaotic landscape of a society drowning in a sea of meaningless noise, understood that his words were no longer just a means of personal survival, they were a profound, dangerous responsibility. He had cracked the foundational code of human belief, discovering that reality itself is a fluid, highly unstable construct, constantly being shaped and reshaped by those who possess the courage and the terrifying skill to manipulate the underlying, hypnotic architecture of human language. The trance was everywhere, a permanent, invisible fog blanketing the entire world, and he was one of the very few who held the power to decide exactly what the sleeping masses would dream. As he refined his dark craft, the master recognized a profound vulnerability in the human psyche, the desperate, agonizing craving for personal validation. The masses did not simply want to be entertained, they wanted to feel deeply, profoundly understood. They wanted their secret struggles acknowledged by an invisible authority. He began to weaponize empathy, using it not to heal, but to bind the reader to his narrative. He would describe the reader's internal monologue with such terrifying accuracy that it felt less like reading a page and more like telepathy. He articulated the quiet, suffocating dread of mediocrity that haunted the midnight hours of the common man. He painted agonizingly precise portraits of the crushing weight of unfulfilled potential, the bitter sting of invisible failures, and the terrifying, paralyzing fear of dying completely unnoticed by the universe. When a reader encountered these perfectly crafted reflections of their own soul, the psychological defenses completely collapsed. The skepticism evaporated, replaced by a desperate, overwhelming sense of gratitude toward the unseen author who finally, truly understood their pain. This was the ultimate stage of the waking trance, a state of complete emotional surrender where the reader willingly handed over the keys to their subconscious kingdom. The master writer no longer had to persuade, he merely had to suggest. The reader, completely intoxicated by the illusion of absolute intimacy, would enthusiastically adopt the writer's beliefs, desires, and commands as their very own. They would vehemently defend these newly implanted ideas against all logical counterarguments, fiercely protecting the very psychological cage that had been so masterfully constructed around them. It was a terrifying testament to the absolute malleability of the human spirit. A dark realization that free will, in the face of truly hypnotic language, is often nothing more than a comforting illusion. The architect of the text had become a puppet master, pulling the invisible strings of emotion to orchestrate the actions of thousands, forever changing the course of their lives with the stroke of a pen. He understood that every written word is a loaded weapon, pointing directly at the reader's mind, waiting for the perfect moment to violently discharge its payload of belief. He saw the world not as a collection of independent thinkers, but as a vast, echoing chamber of competing trances, a brutal battlefield where the most captivating story always, inevitably, conquers the truth. The mastery of hypnotic writing was the ultimate realization that he who controls the words controls the very fabric of human destiny. The silent war for the human mind rages on, entirely unnoticed by the casualties, orchestrated by the invisible masters of the written word who constantly rewrite the underlying code of our shared reality. The words on the page are not passive ink, they are living, breathing parasites of the mind, seeking to colonize the consciousness and dictate the future. This is the terrifying, beautiful, and absolute reality of the hypnotic scribe, a solitary figure casting immense, invisible shadows across the entire span of human history, shaping the rise and fall of empires with the quiet, devastating power of a perfectly constructed sentence. The journey into the dark heart of persuasion leaves no reader unchanged, forever shattering the illusion of linguistic innocence and exposing the brutal, magnificent mechanics of the human soul. The ultimate tragedy and the ultimate triumph of the written word lay exposed before him. A vast ocean of psychological potential waiting for the spark of a masterful sentence to ignite it into a roaring, uncontrollable inferno of belief. He sat before his blank parchment, no longer a mere beggar of attention, but a god of syntax, ready to whisper a new reality into the susceptible, waiting ears of the dreaming world. Every keystroke was a calculated strike against the fortress of the conscious mind. Every period a definitive seal on a newly implanted thought. The world outside his window continued its frantic, meaningless dance, oblivious to the fact that its very desires, its greatest fears, and its ultimate destiny were being quietly forged by the solitary architect of the hypnotic text, weaving the invisible chains of persuasion link by meticulous link. The invisible chains of persuasion, once forged in the fires of desperation, now felt remarkably heavy upon the hands of the master architect. He had conquered the mechanics of the human mind, systematically reducing the complex tapestry of free will into a predictable series of biological triggers and emotional responses. Yet, standing at the absolute pinnacle of this dark art, a profound and terrifying silence began to echo within the vast, hollow chambers of his own success. The wealth he had accumulated through the flawless execution of hypnotic syntax was staggering. A literal empire constructed entirely of meticulously arranged verbs and strategically deployed adjectives. But the initial thrill of absolute control had slowly, inevitably metastasized into a suffocating, paralyzing existential dread. He looked out over the sprawling masses of humanity, watching them blindly follow the invisible paths he had carved into their subconscious minds. And he realized with a crushing, inescapable clarity that he had become a prisoner of his own devastating creation. To view every human interaction as a calculated transaction, to see every agonizing tear or joyous laugh merely as an exploitable vulnerability, was to entirely strip the universe of its inherent, beautiful mystery. The master of the waking trance found himself trapped in a nightmare of utter, agonizing isolation, surrounded by millions of minds that he could effortlessly manipulate but with whom he could no longer authentically, genuinely connect. This agonizing spiritual crisis forced a radical, violent evolution in his understanding of the written word. He recognized that the ultimate, absolute power of language was not merely the ability to deceive the conscious mind, but the infinitely more difficult, infinitely more magnificent capacity to heal the fractured human soul. The dark magic of manipulation had to be transmuted into the blinding, radiant light of genuine, transformative inspiration. This profound philosophical metamorphosis required the destruction of his most deeply held, cynical beliefs about the nature of persuasion. He had previously operated under the assumption that the truth was entirely irrelevant, a malleable construct that could be infinitely distorted as long as the emotional triggers were struck with sufficient, ruthless force. But he now discovered a deeper, hidden law of human psychology, a fail-safe mechanism buried deep within the collective unconscious. The human animal, he realized, possesses an incredibly sophisticated, almost supernatural radar for inauthenticity. While a brilliantly constructed lie might temporarily bypass the logical defenses, the subconscious mind of the reader is constantly, relentlessly scanning the text for the microscopic, invisible energetic signature of the author's true intent. If the writer does not fundamentally, passionately believe in the absolute righteousness of their own message, a subtle, undetectable dissonance bleeds into the rhythmic cadence of the prose. The words become hollow, the emotional appeals ring slightly flat, and the waking trance becomes fragile, easily shattered by the slightest breeze of skepticism. The master architect understood that to achieve the ultimate, unbreakable state of hypnotic resonance, he could no longer rely on calculated deception. He had to become a conduit for absolute, unvarnished, and terrifying truth. He had to meticulously align his own internal reality with the external message he was projecting into the world. He began to apply the brutal, unforgiving light of his analytical mind to his own internal landscape, systematically identifying and destroying his own hidden biases, his deeply rooted fears, and his lingering, parasitic doubts. The act of writing ceased to be a mechanical process of assembling psychological traps and transformed into a profound, terrifying act of spiritual purification. He realized that the most powerful, irresistible hook in existence is not a fabricated promise of unearned wealth, but the raw, bleeding, and undeniable authenticity of a human being who has walked through the fires of hell and returned with a genuine map to salvation. To channel this level of raw, unmitigated authenticity onto the page, the master had to master a second, entirely different form of hypnosis, the hypnosis of the self. He recognized that the conscious, analytical mind, with its endless barrage of self-doubt, grammatical anxiety, and paralyzing perfectionism, was the ultimate enemy of the creative flow. To write words that breathed, words that possessed the kinetic, explosive energy necessary to capture a stranger's soul, he had to completely bypass his own critical faculties. He developed a meticulous, sacred ritual to induce a state of profound, waking trance within himself before his fingers ever touched the keys. He would isolate himself in complete, unbroken silence, deliberately slowing his breathing until it matched the deep, rhythmic tide of a sleeping ocean. He would visualize the exact, specific individual he was writing to, not a faceless demographic, but a single, desperately suffering human soul sitting alone in the dark, silently crying out for an answer. He would aggressively, intentionally merge his consciousness with the pain of this imagined reader, allowing their fears, their unfulfilled desires, and their silent, agonizing screams to completely overwhelm his own identity. In this state of total, empathetic possession, the logical brain completely surrendered, and the raw, unfiltered voice of the subconscious took absolute command. The words did not come from a process of intellectual deduction, they erupted violently from the deepest, most primal regions of his being, flowing onto the page in a torrential, unstoppable flood of pure, unadulterated emotion. He wrote with the desperate, frantic speed of a man attempting to transcribe the absolute dictates of an angry god, completely ignoring typos, structural flaws, and logical inconsistencies. The only objective was to capture the wild, untamed lightning of pure inspiration before it vanished back into the dark, churning clouds of the mind. It was only after the raw, pulsating mass of text had been violently expelled onto the page that the cold, calculating architect returned to the forefront of consciousness. This was the grueling, agonizing phase of hypnotic revision, a brutal, uncompromising process of linguistic surgery where the chaotic, overgrown jungle of inspiration was mercilessly pruned and sculpted into a terrifyingly efficient engine of persuasion. The master writer understood that every single syllable was a heavy, physical weight upon the reader's attention span, and any word that did not actively, aggressively propel the narrative forward was a parasite that had to be ruthlessly excised. He read his drafts aloud, pacing the floor like a caged predator, obsessively listening to the rhythmic, musical cadence of the sentences. He searched for the slightest, microscopic stumble in the flow, the tiniest cognitive speed bump that might jolt the reader out of the delicate, carefully constructed waking trance. He deployed the explosive, sensory-rich vocabulary he had mastered in his early days, substituting weak, passive verbs with violent, kinetic actions that dragged the reader's imagination violently forward. But now, these weapons were not used to deceive, but to brutally, unsparingly clarify the truth. He used the agonizing tension of the open loop not to string the reader along for a cheap sale, but to force them to confront their own deepest, most terrifying self-deceptions. The narrative became a flawless, polished mirror, reflecting back not a fabricated fantasy, but the absolute, undeniable reality of the reader's own infinite, untapped potential. The editing process was a relentless, exhausting pursuit of linguistic perfection, a terrifying alchemy that distilled the sprawling chaos of human emotion into a single, devastatingly sharp point of undeniable clarity. As the master architect finally reached the zenith of his understanding, he looked back upon the long, blood-stained road of his psychological conquests and realized the ultimate, devastating irony of his existence. He had spent his entire life desperately seeking the power to completely control the minds of others, only to discover that the only mind he truly needed to conquer was his own. The profound, inescapable tragedy of the human condition is not that we are immune to the power of words, but that we are already deeply, hopelessly hypnotized by a continuous, overwhelming barrage of negative, limiting narratives. From the moment of birth, society aggressively implants a complex, suffocating code of self-doubt, fear, and perceived inadequacy directly into the fertile soil of the subconscious. The masses wander through their entire lives in a deep, agonizing somnambulism, completely convinced that their suffering is inevitable. Their dreams are impossible, and their voices are entirely meaningless. They are trapped in a dark, suffocating trance dictated by the news, by their peers, and by their own relentless, critical inner monologues. The true, terrifyingly beautiful purpose of the hypnotic writer is not to put people to sleep, but to violently, aggressively jolt them awake. It is to use the dark, powerful mechanics of persuasion to shatter the invisible, psychological chains that bind humanity to its own self-imposed mediocrity. The master realized that his meticulously crafted sentences were not weapons of exploitation, they were heavy, linguistic sledgehammers designed to smash through the thick, impenetrable walls of societal conditioning. He was no longer a manipulator of the weak, he had become a fierce, uncompromising liberator of the human spirit. He deployed his sensory-rich language to paint glorious, undeniable visions of a life lived at the absolute limit of potential. using the agonizing tension of his open loops to force his readers to stare directly into the terrifying, magnificent abyss of their own forgotten greatness. This is the ultimate, profound revelation hidden within the dark, mesmerizing depths of this revolutionary approach to language. The core message that this philosophy intends to violently hammer into the consciousness of the reader is that reality is not a static, unyielding physical environment that we merely inhabit. It is a highly fluid, infinitely malleable psychological construct that is continuously, relentlessly generated by the words we choose to consume and the narratives we choose to believe. The book serves as a terrifying, unavoidable mirror, forcing the reader to recognize that they are already a master hypnotist, constantly, relentlessly using the power of their own internal dialogue to talk themselves out of their dreams, to justify their failures, and to reinforce their own agonizing limitations. To study this dark art is to accept a profound, terrifying, and ultimate responsibility for the architecture of one's own existence. It is the uncompromising demand to cease being a passive, unconscious victim of the world's aggressive linguistic programming, and to deliberately, ruthlessly seize control of the narrative. The true master of this craft understands that every sentence they write, every email they send, and every word they speak is a highly volatile, magical incantation that will either build a bridge to absolute salvation or forge another link in the heavy, suffocating chain of human despair. The power to alter the fundamental trajectory of human history, to reshape the borders of nations, and to heal the deepest, most agonizing fractures of the human heart has never resided in the edge of a sword or the blast of a bomb. It has always, eternally, resided in the quiet, devastating, and absolute authority of the written word. Language is the ultimate, invisible architecture of the human soul. Master the words, and you command the very fabric of reality itself.